Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we'll see what happened when Fred Seaman, the personal assistant to John Lennon, met up with Julian and what led to the missing diaries that had been John's. This is Fred's side of the story, so I'm not saying that what is presented is the truth. In the last part of the video, I found an article online from heydullblog.com which tells the story of the diary from different points of view. And the friend of Fred's that he takes the journals to states that Fred told him that John wanted him to write a true story of his days at the Dakota. So Fred and his friend began to get the story together using the journals that Fred had gotten from the Dakota. So now let's see Fred's version of the events. The night John died, there was a lot of activity going on at the Dakota. Crowds of fans were outside the building, and they stayed there all night and the next morning. Fred Seaman was in shock and very upset over the death of John. People kept calling the apartment, and Julian called to ask if he could see Yoko and Sean. And Yoko said it would be okay, but she didn't know what could be done about Cynthia. At 9 a.m., Yoko had gotten dressed and was ready for business. She had tried to sleep around 5 a.m., but the fans wouldn't leave, and they were still making noise outside the Dakota. And later, Yoko came up with an announcement to say to the crowd, and in it she said, there is no funeral for John. Later in the week, we will set a time for a silent vigil to pray for his soul. We invite you to participate from wherever you are at the same time. We thank you for many flowers sent to John, but in the future, instead of flowers, please consider donations in his name to the Spirit Foundation Incorporated, which is John's personal charitable foundation. He would have appreciated it very much. John loved and prayed for the human race. Please pray the same for him. Love, Yoko and Sean. Fred goes to pick Julian up from the airport. Doug, who works security for Sean, went with Fred to pick up Julian at the airport. On the way there, Fred kept thinking about John and how he must have looked in his last moments. And then he thought of him in Bermuda, swaying to the reggae sound of Bob Marley and the Wailers. He said he felt like crying, but he didn't. So Doug mentioned to Fred that John's remains were to be cremated, and Doug arranged several hearses to leave the funeral home so that the press wouldn't know where the cremation would take place. So Julian arrived at the airport at 9 o'clock p.m., and Fred said he was wearing a leather jacket and jeans, and he had long hair, and he looked so much like John. And Fred told Julian how sorry he was as they walked back to the car. Julian said he had run out of tears because he'd been crying all the way on the flight, and he kept smoking one cigarette after another. Julian said his mom had not been at the house, and that night his chimney had collapsed and it left a hole in the roof. He had a feeling something was wrong, and when Julian got up and saw the journalists outside the house, Julian's stepfather told him the bad news. Julian asked how Sean was doing, and Fred said he had a fever, and he didn't want to say that Sean still didn't know what had happened yet. And Julian asked if they knew who did it, and Fred told about Mark Chapman that it didn't know at the moment what his motive was for killing John. And Julian said he hoped his dad hadn't suffered much, and they were both silent on the ride. Arriving at the Dakota, a crowd mobbed them. Julian was frightened and confused and put his hands up to his face. Doug, the bodyguard, led the way through the crowd, and they finally got to the basement of the Dakota. And when they got up to the apartment, Helen hugged Julian. Helen was the housekeeper, and she was Fred's aunt. And Julian asked how Yoko was, and Fred said Yoko was fine. At the moment, she was having dinner with David Geffen in Calvin Klein in Harlem. So Fred decided he wanted to quit. Fred had the feeling that Yoko wasn't grieving but looking to gain a more positive image from the public and to make money off it. So Fred called Yoko to say he wanted to quit. Yoko said he was behaving irrationally and needed a break from the Dakota, and she was sending Julian to Cold Harbor and asked Fred to join him, and he did. They spent a few tranquil days there and watched TV coverage of the silent vigil for John held in Central Park Sunday, December the 14th. And Yoko released the following statement to the media. Bless you for your tears and prayers. I saw John smiling in the sky. I saw sorrow changing into clarity. I saw all of us becoming one mind. Thank you. Love, Yoko. Later, Fred and Julian were summoned back to the Dakota. Fred wanted to leave once again, but Yoko asked that he stay until the summer of 1981. She needed help to spread John's legacy. She said it would be like leaving John. And Fred got angry because it seemed like Yoko, the staff, the lawyers, accountants, and psychics, and others were making it seem like John was a distant memory. Okay, now we come to the journals. Fred was asked to get a diary by John written in 1980 to Yoko. She said she would file it with John's other writings. And Fred thought back to the conversation he had with John Lennon in Bermuda 5 months before. He said he wanted Julian to have his journals if anything happened to him. So Yoko was afraid that Julian and his mother might challenge the provisions of John's will, which appointed Yoko executrix of the John's estate. Since Fred was the only one close to Julian, he was like the middleman. So one day, while looking for a cassette for Yoko, Fred came across an attaché case containing John's journals from 1974 to 1979. When he saw the journals, Fred made the decision to deliver the journals to Julian, who was in London. He felt that John wanted his oldest son to have them. It was a request that John had made to Fred in Bermuda. So this part made sense to me, but then later I see where it could be him feeling greedy, that he could see the making money from those diaries. So it's hard to know what to believe. So Fred knew that Yoko wouldn't like it if he gave the journals to Julian, and she made it clear that she didn't want Julian to have any of his father's things. She had countermanded John's instructions to send Julian a copy of his Bermuda demo songs. She thought Julian would sell them to a bootlegger. So I don't know. I guess she didn't know if she could trust Julian or not. Fred walked out with the attaché case that had John's diaries, and here is where Fred went wrong. He decided to tell someone. Fred got together with a college friend, and this guy worked with Fred's uncle. Fred said he looked up to him. The betrayal. The friend told Fred that he would make duplicates while Fred packed for the London trip, and then Fred would take the originals back to the Dakota. Later in the evening, the friend called Fred and said he wanted to use the diaries to write a book, and Fred could collaborate. Next, Fred made another questionable move by seeing his therapist and asking for his help on the matter, and the therapist said he would help. So he told Fred he needed a troubleshooter, and he suggested a patient of his who was a wealthy businessman. So Fred wasn't sure about this, but his only other alternative was to tell Yoko everything, and he was afraid to face her, not knowing how she would react. So the troubleshooter suggested that Fred agree with his friend's idea to collaborate on the book, and he told Fred to suggest he might have a backer to finance the book. A deal was made, and Fred's friend agreed to turn over the diaries by offering him an expense-paid vacation to a Caribbean island of his choice. The kicker was he had to turn over the journals, and the friend agreed. January 1982, shortly after Fred had quit his job with Yoko, John's journals were turned over to the troubleshooter. In exchange, the friend of Fred's got a 3-month employment contract plus $3,000 spending money for his vacation. The troubleshooter insisted that he would keep the journals for a while, and he promised Fred he would find a way to return the diaries to Yoko through an intermediary. Fred didn't like any of this and complained to the therapist. The therapist believed in his patient, the troubleshooter, and Fred had thoughts once more of telling Yoko and face the consequences. He kept hoping it would all work out with no harm done. So this is where the dominoes start falling. So Fred's friend found out he had been scammed, but he had stashed away copies of the Lennon journals. He then decided to try and sell them to Rolling Stone magazine. And then here's where things fell apart. The publisher, Jan Wenner, was friendly with Yoko and told her that he had been approached by someone offering to sell copies of Lennon's diaries. Yoko then put Elliot Mintz, her publicist, on the case, and he found out quickly about Fred's friend, and that led to the friend trying to get off the hook, so he named Fred Seaman as the mastermind for trying to get a book on his diaries done. He also implicated the therapist and the troubleshooter. Now Fred decided it was a good time to call Yoko and tell her what happened. He called her in late August of 1981, and she said, "How could you do this to me?" angrily. So then Fred tried to explain that he wanted to deliver the journals to Julian because he firmly believed that was what John would have wanted. He said he wasn't trying to hurt her, and he deeply regretted the trouble he had caused. Well, she didn't want to hear his reasons and turned the phone over to her chief of security, Dan Mahoney, a New York City police sergeant assigned to an undercover career criminal apprehension unit. Mahoney wanted to meet up with Fred. And when he got there to meet Fred, he had Rich De Palma with him. And he had worked for Yoko, and he didn't stay long. De Palma didn't. And after a few minutes, he went back to work. Mahoney told Fred that the troubleshooter had returned the journals to Yoko for a $60,000 finder's fee. Well, that guy was scum. And then the bad thing was that John's journal of the 1980 was missing, and everyone felt that Fred had it. Everyone from the Dakota, that is. The troubleshooter said he knew nothing about the 1980 journal. Fred insisted that he didn't have it, but Mahoney didn't believe him. He warned Fred that if he didn't turn it over, Sam Havatoy was ready to play hardball. The security man said to Fred, "I like you, Freddie, and I wouldn't want to see you get hurt." A month later, Fred said he was abducted by Bob Grieve and Barry Goldblatt, 2 cops who moonlighted as Yoko's bodyguards. They beat him and put a gun to his head. They searched his pockets and got a key to his apartment. Then they took him to the 20th Precinct Station House on West 22nd Street. He was met with Detective Lieutenant Robert Gibbons. Fred angrily said to him that he had been assaulted by 2 cops who privately worked as Yoko's bodyguards. Fred was then told that there was a warrant for his arrest, and it was based on a complaint by Sam Havatoy, and he said the beating was Fred's word against the cops. The detective said he wanted to take a look at Fred's apartment just to make sure he didn't have the diary or any things that Havatoy said Fred had that he claimed that were stolen from the Dakota, such as John's clothes, artwork, stereo equipment, and guitars. The detective said he could get a search warrant, but it would take time, and it was possible one of the security guards could enter the apartment himself. Fred didn't feel like he had any choice and agreed. While they were there, they filled several shopping bags full of things that they felt might have belonged to Yoko. John's shopping list and other papers from Fred's files, cassettes of John's music, including Double Fantasy, copies of Yoko's Walking on Thin Ice, and a woman videotapes, and a framed drawing by Sean that had been given to Fred by John in 1979. Then they took Fred back to the police station. So Fred had to sign a confession. He was asked to sign a confession was written on a yellow notepad that said that Fred had taken things from the Dakota without Yoko's approval. Fred then said the only thing he had taken without the approval were the journals, and they were back with Yoko in her possession. The detective said that they believed him, and they insisted he signed the paper anyway so they could finish their paperwork. Fred said that they would change the wording later, and that once he signed the paper he could go home. Fred was afraid that he might be beaten again, so he signed it. And once he signed it, he was put in jail overnight. Fred said he was in jail for 12 hours, but never read his rights. He was fingerprinted and booked. Fred was sent to a room where Assistant District Attorney Consuelo Fernandez was waiting to interrogate him in front of a video camera. So normally that is only done in homicides. And Fred told his side of the story, explaining strange circumstance of the disappearance of Lennon's journals. When Fred got to the part of his abduction and beating by Yoko's bodyguards, the interview was stopped, and Fred spent another night in jail, and he was arraigned on September 29th. After that, he was released on his own recognizance. Fred gets a lawyer. Fred hired John Esposito as his lawyer. He filed a civil suit against Yoko Havatoy in New York City in connection with his assault. In 1983, he filed a complaint with the Police Department Internal Affairs Unit, as well as a notice claim to the state Supreme Court alleging assault, battery, harassment, false arrest, false imprisonment, kidnapping, intentional mental distress, illegal interrogation, illegal search and seizure, and violation of constitutional and civil rights at the hands of the members of the New York Police Department. And he got the law firm of Zelma and Grossman to handle that. So on December 8th, 2 years after John's death, the September charges were dropped. Fred assumed it was the end of the criminal case against him, but he said it was just the beginning. In a letter from February the 18th, 1983, Assistant D.A. Fernandez said she was bringing the case before a grand jury. He was charged with 4 counts of grand larceny for stealing John's journals. Since he signed a confession and admitted to taking the journals on videotape, he was indicted in the case. And Fred's lawyers advised him to plead guilty to a reduced charge of criminal possession, a misdemeanor. Of the May 27th hearing, he was presented a copy of the plea bargain agreement. The words criminal possession had been crossed out and replaced with grand larceny, and Fred said he didn't want to sign that. The judge suggested that Fred talk to the lawyer outside the courtroom, and they went out into the hallway. And the lawyer told him that if Fred wanted to go to trial, he would have to pay him and his partner more money. And he placed 2 papers in front of him, the plea bargain agreement and a $10,000 retainer letter. He told Fred he would have to sign one of the 2. And Fred said he'd already paid the lawyers a total of $10,000, and he said he had no intention of signing the new retainer agreement, and the lawyer threatened to walk out. Fred said he felt trapped. He agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of grand larceny. He stated for the record that it had not been his intention of profiting by taking the journals. On July the 14th, 1983, Fred was sentenced to 5 years probation by Judge Atlas. In October 1984, Fred filed a motion to vacate his guilty plea on the basis of ineffective assistance of counsel. It was denied by Judge Atlas, and a request for permission to appeal was denied by the appellate division in 1985. Fred was granted an early termination from probation in 1986. Fred said he spent nearly $30,000 in legal fees, so it was financially impossible for him to pursue his legal claim against Yoko, Havatoy, and New York City. Fred regrets. Fred states that 10 years after the incident, he felt it was irresponsible of him to take John's journals, regardless of how well-intentioned he was. Fred insisted that it was never his intention to steal the diaries. Fred felt that his criminal conviction was largely due to a result of Yoko's ability to influence overzealous prosecutors. And Fred said he had vivid memories of his time with John, and he hoped he made John's life a little easier, and Fred sometimes thought he was John's friend. So, an update on more legal woes for Fred. In 1999, Fred threatened to sue Capitol Records over their use of a photograph that he claimed was his copyright. In 1999, Fred threatened to sue Capitol Records over their use of a photograph he claimed was his copyright, and Yoko promptly hit back. The case eventually went to trial in 2002. Yoko's lawyers used Seaman's own diaries to incriminate him. Rosen also testified on Yoko's behalf. She won a verdict that received wide media attention. The court judgment forbid Last Days, the book that Fred had written, to be reprinted, and established that the photographs in question were works for hire, and forced Seaman to return any and all Lennon-Ono items in his possession. In the judgment, Seaman admitted that he had stolen and sold items belonging to them. His full statement read, "I wish to offer this public apology to Yoko Ono. I did wrong by you, and indeed am guilty of violating your trust. After more than 20 years, it's time for me to ask your forgiveness for my actions. I did, in fact, steal items from you that once belonged to John. These include diaries, documents, and more. I wrote things about you in my book and various tabloids that were factually inaccurate, and I now realize how much pain and embarrassment I have caused. It is impossible to undo what has taken place, but it stops here and now. I will return any remaining things I have of yours. I refrain from ever writing anything about you or your family or about my time in your employ. I offer no excuse for my conduct and only ask that you can find it in your heart to forgive so that I can move on with my life." And then, I guess in 2020, Fred forgot about that, and he gave a video interview in which he reportedly displayed Lennon's memorabilia, including one of the copyrighted photos that triggered the 1999 lawsuit and 2002 trial. Mused about republishing Last Days and otherwise violated the terms of the 2002 trial's consent judgment, Yoko promptly hit him with another copyright lawsuit. They settled in January 2021, and he is now forbidden to speak about John at all. It is hard to believe the real motives of Fred Seaman. In his book, The Last Days of John Lennon, he claims that his main reason of taking the journals was to let Julian have them because that is what John wanted to happen. If that is true, why didn't Fred just make copies of them himself, get the originals back to the Dakota, and leave it be? Instead, he gets other people involved, which makes it suspicious or makes him look very naive. The later lawsuits against him show another side of Fred. He's trying to make a profit from his time as John's assistant. And it's terrible when someone dies and everyone starts to get greedy and only see money signs. And it's really amped up when the person is famous, such as in the case of John Lennon. So I had never heard the story of the journals, and reading the book The Last Days, the story is there. So there's always two sides to every story, and at times three. If the story Fred portrayed isn't the truth, I feel bad for Yoko and Sean. I would have been angry too if somebody had stolen things that belonged rightly to her because she was John's wife and he was her husband. So the fact that it was done so soon after John's death is rotten too. So I thought I would give the Beatle fans a chance to see the incident and draw their own conclusions. Seeing these stories from different angles makes one feel like they're on a jury themselves, and it's up to the viewer to decide the truth. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I also hope that everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.